The United States of America almost never existed. Not because the British Army was too powerful, not because George Washington made too many tactical mistakes, and not because the 13 colonies were too divided to ever form a nation. No. The real reason the American Revolution nearly collapsed has nothing to do with muskets or battle formations or political manifestos. It has everything to do with a group of French aristocrats sitting in the gilded halls of Versailles, nursing ancient grudges against Britain and making cold, calculated bets on a revolution they did not fully believe in. And that, right there, is the thing that should stop you cold. Because the most democratic experiment in human history was kept breathing by one of the most absolute monarchies the world had ever seen. Think about the sheer audacity of that contradiction. The United States, a nation built on the radical idea that ordinary people have the right to govern themselves, was rescued from collapse by a king who ruled by divine right. A king who taxed his own subjects into poverty, who imprisoned people without trial, who owned the land and the people on it. Louis XVI of France did not send money and soldiers to America because he believed in liberty. He did it because he hated Britain. Pure, simple, burning. Jealousy. And that jealousy changed the course of world history forever. The story of the French alliance is not a footnote in the history of the American Revolution. It is the spine of the whole thing. Without French gold, Washington's army would have dissolved into nothing by the winter of 1777. Without the French Navy, Yorktown would never have happened, and Cornwallis would never have surrendered. Without French diplomats working in the shadows of every European court, the revolution would have been strangled in its crib by British pressure. And without one extraordinary French aristocrat who literally sailed across the Atlantic against direct royal orders to fight for a country that was not his own, the story might have ended very differently indeed. So who were these people? What were they actually thinking? What did France want from all of this? And what did it cost them in the end? Because here is the part the textbooks always skip. France did not just help America win independence. France helped America survive, and then watched as the very ideas it helped unleash came home to Paris like a boomerang and destroyed the French monarchy itself within a single decade. The revolution France funded in America returned to its source, and the same men who had cheered for Washington would find themselves staring up at guillotine blades in the Place de la Révolution. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let us start at the beginning. Let us start with a catastrophe. To understand why France was so desperately eager to hurt Britain in 1775, you have to go back 12 years earlier to one of the most consequential diplomatic moments of the 18th century. 1763, the Treaty of Paris. Not the one that ended the American Revolution, the one signed after the 7 Years' War. And for France, it was nothing less than a national humiliation so complete, so devastating, that an entire generation of French soldiers, diplomats, and noblemen never emotionally recovered from what happened at that table. The 7 Years' War was, in a very real sense, the first true world war. It was fought on 5 continents simultaneously. It involved every major European power in a shifting, churning web of alliances and betrayals, and it ended with Britain emerging as the undisputed master of the globe. France lost Canada. France lost most of its territories in India. France lost influence across the Caribbean. France lost its foothold in West Africa. The empire that Cardinal Richelieu and Louis XIV had spent a century building was stripped away in a single treaty negotiated at a table where France had almost no leverage and no good options. It was catastrophic. It was humiliating, and the French ruling class knew exactly who to blame. There is a particular kind of hatred that forms between nations who are almost equal in power and ambition. Not the contempt you might feel for something weak and foreign, but the hot, grinding fury of a rivalry between peers, where every success of the other side feels like a personal wound. Britain and France had been locked in this exact kind of hatred for centuries. They had fought wars on every ocean and in every corner of the planet. They had destroyed each other's colonies, burned each other's ships, and assassinated each other's allies with methodical dedication. And in 1763, Britain won. Decisively, humiliatingly, completely. The wound was deep, and it did not close. The men who signed that treaty were not just diplomats doing their professional duty. They were representatives of a wounded aristocratic culture that defined itself through military glory and imperial reach. And now, they had to watch British ships sail through waters that used to be French. They had to watch British merchants dominate trade routes that used to generate French wealth. They had to smile politely at diplomatic receptions while British lords bragged about the empire that had just swallowed their world whole. The fury that built up inside the French court during those 12 years between 1763 and 1775 was immense. It was patient, it was focused, and it was looking for its opportunity with the cold efficiency of a man sharpening a blade in the dark. When American colonists began their revolt against British rule in 1775, the French court did not immediately see a noble struggle for liberty and self-determination. Not at first. What they saw was a weapon. A beautiful, perfectly timed instrument that could be used to destabilize Britain from within its own empire and give France the revenge it had been nursing for over a decade. The question was not whether to support the Americans in some form. The question was how to do it without triggering another full-scale war before France was militarily and financially ready to fight one. And answering that question was the job of one of the most remarkable and underappreciated strategic minds of the entire era. Charles Gravier, the Comte de Vergennes, Foreign Minister of France, the man who had architected the entire strategy of French intervention in the American Revolution. A character so complex, so brilliantly calculating, and so historically significant that it is genuinely astonishing how few Americans have ever heard his name. Vergennes was not a romantic. He was not a man who lay awake at night dreaming of liberty and the rights of man. He was a career diplomat of the old school, trained in the cold, transactional logic of European power politics, where nations had interests rather than values, and alliances existed to be exploited rather than honored out of sentiment. Vergennes was approximately 60 years old in 1775. He was a lean, careful man with deep-set eyes and the measured speech of someone who had spent decades in courts where a single careless word could end a career or start a war. He had been French ambassador to Constantinople and then to Sweden, postings that required constant vigilance, constant reading of complex political situations, and constant management of contradictory pressures. He was not brilliant in a flashy way. He was brilliant in the way that water is brilliant, patient, adaptable, finding every crack and working into it until something gave way. He had watched France lose ground to Britain on every front imaginable for his entire adult life. And when news arrived in Versailles that the American colonists had taken up arms against the crown, he recognized immediately what it meant. Vergennes sat down and wrote a memorandum to Louis XVI that was, by any measure, one of the most consequential documents of the 18th century. It was calm, methodical, and absolutely ruthless in its logic. He argued that France had a once-in-a-generation opportunity to cripple British power by supporting the colonial rebellion. Not with open military force, not yet, but with money, with weapons, with covert shipments of gunpowder and artillery that could keep the American army in the field long enough to drain British resources, bog down British troops, and damage British prestige across Europe. He was not asking the king to believe in American democracy or care about colonial rights. He was asking him to fund a very profitable act of strategic revenge wrapped in the language of commerce and deniability. Louis XVI agreed. Because Louis, for all his personal timidity and political confusion, understood the humiliation of 1763 just as deeply as any other member of his court. He was a heavy-set young man of 20 when he took the throne, painfully shy, more comfortable at his locksmith's bench than at diplomatic negotiations, deeply devout and deeply uncertain of himself in most situations that required decisive leadership. But he had inherited more than a throne. He had inherited a burning national memory of what Britain had done to France, and that memory lived in his chest like an ember that never quite went out. He approved Vergennes' plan, and in doing so, he set in motion a chain of events that neither he nor anyone else in that room could fully anticipate or control. The first requirement was secrecy of a very high order. France could not openly send money and weapons to American rebels without triggering immediate British retaliation, possibly a direct military response or the kind of diplomatic crisis that could force France into a war before it was ready. Vergennes needed a cover story. He needed a fictional commercial enterprise convincing enough to channel French government funds to the Continental Army without leaving official fingerprints on anything. And for that kind of operation, for the running of a sophisticated covert fiction at scale, he needed someone with just the right combination of creative genius, patriotic conviction, and absolute moral flexibility about the boundaries between legitimate business and state-sponsored deception. He found his man in one of the most purely alive human beings of the entire 18th century. Pierre-Augustin Caron de Beaumarchais. Yes, that Beaumarchais. The man who would go on to write The Barber of Seville and The Marriage of Figaro, two plays so devastatingly witty and so politically sharp that they gave birth to the magnificent operas by Rossini and Mozart and scandalized European courts from Paris to Vienna. But in 1776, before the plays that made him immortal, Beaumarchais was already something extraordinary. Playwright, courtier, spy, arms dealer, revolutionary financier, self-made man who had built himself from nothing, loudmouth, genius, scandal. He was all of these things simultaneously, and he managed to be absolutely irresistible to everyone who encountered him, including the French foreign minister who needed someone to run a fake trading company. Beaumarchais was born in 1732 in Paris, the son of a clockmaker, not an aristocrat, not a man of inherited wealth or ancient noble blood. Everything he achieved in his remarkable life, and he achieved a staggering amount, he achieved through wit and talent and nerve, and a complete refusal to accept the limitations that French society tried to impose on a man without a title. He taught himself music as a child and became a celebrated harpist who taught the royal princesses. He taught himself the law as a young man and won a series of famous court battles against powerful noblemen who had cheated him, turning each case into a public spectacle that made him a hero to ordinary Parisians and a source of constant irritation to the aristocracy. He was simultaneously charming and mocking. He charmed his way into the court of Louis XV. He served as an unofficial agent for the French crown in several delicate diplomatic missions across Europe. He wrote plays that savaged the aristocracy so ruthlessly and so brilliantly that Louis XVI himself initially banned The Marriage of Figaro before being forced by popular demand to eventually relent. The character of Figaro, the clever, low-born servant who outsmarts his noble master at every turn, was essentially Beaumarchais himself, drawn from life. And the audiences who roared with laughter at Figaro knew exactly who they were laughing with and who they were laughing at. When Vergennes approached Beaumarchais about running the covert funding operation for the American rebels, the playwright had already been serving as an unofficial French spy for several years. He understood intimately what it meant to operate in the gray zones of European politics, where official deniability was the most precious currency of all. He understood that what Vergennes needed was not a conventional soldier or a conventional diplomat. It needed a showman, someone who could construct a fictional reality convincing enough to simultaneously fool the British government, the American Continental Congress, and the French public, all at the same time, while managing the impossible logistical challenge of moving military supplies across the Atlantic Ocean without getting caught in the act. So Beaumarchais created Rodrigue Hortalez et Compagnie, a fake trading company, a magnificent fiction. On paper, it was a private Spanish and French merchant enterprise engaged in perfectly ordinary commercial activity. In reality, it was a one-man covert operation funded by the French and Spanish crowns to ship weapons, artillery, ammunition, uniforms, tents, and every conceivable military supply to the Continental Army. Between 1776 and 1777, Beaumarchais organized and shipped roughly 90% of all the gunpowder used by American forces in the crucial early years of the war. 90% of the gunpowder that kept the revolution alive came through a fake company run by a playwright. If that does not blow your mind slightly, you may need to read that sentence again. And he did all of this while simultaneously writing letters to American leaders, advising them on strategy, cultivating contacts within the Continental Congress, managing a staff of agents and couriers across multiple countries, and dealing with the constant threat that the whole operation would be exposed by British intelligence, which had spies everywhere and was watching French ports very carefully indeed. The man was operating at a frequency that most people cannot sustain for a week, let alone for years. He was living multiple lives simultaneously and finding each one of them thrilling. He was, in the most fundamental sense, the kind of human being that history produces rarely and never quite knows what to do with when it does. While Beaumarchais moved guns and powder through the shadows, the revolution needed something else just as urgently. It needed a face. It needed someone who could stand publicly in the drawing rooms of Paris and the salons of Versailles and argue passionately for the American cause in a way that made French support feel noble and philosophically coherent, rather than nakedly cynical. France was, after all, a country in the middle of one of the greatest intellectual ferments in European history. The Enlightenment was at its peak. Philosophers, writers, and thinkers were arguing with increasing boldness that human reason should replace royal authority, that natural rights existed independently of royal grants, that governments derived their legitimacy from the consent of the governed. These were not just academic arguments, they were bombs with very long fuses. And the American Revolution was the first real-world test of whether those ideas could actually work. For this role, the Americans sent the most perfectly calibrated human being alive. Benjamin Franklin arrived in Paris in December of 1776. He was 70 years old. He was short and stout and unhurried in his movements. He wore spectacles and a simple brown coat when everyone around him wore silk and gold embroidery. He had a fur cap on his white hair that Parisian society immediately decided was the most charming and authentic thing they had ever seen. He had already lived through 2 or 3 complete careers, as a printer and publisher, as a scientist whose experiments with lightning and electricity had made him one of the most famous men in the world, as a writer and philosopher, as a political leader in Pennsylvania, and then as colonial agent in London. He was the most internationally celebrated American alive, and in Paris, he was something very close to a rock star. The scale of Franklin's celebrity in France is difficult to communicate to a modern audience. In an era before mass media, before photography, before radio or television or the internet, his face was known across Europe from engravings and portraits. People in Paris named streets after him. Young aristocratic women wrote him poetry and begged for the honor of his company at dinner. The intellectuals of the Enlightenment regarded him as living proof that genius could arise from nature rather than from noble birth, that the New World was not just a geographical location, but a state of mind, a place where the old hierarchies did not apply and talent could rise without permission. Franklin understood exactly what this meant, and he played his celebrity with the precision of a master chess player. The simple clothes and the fur cap were not an accident. They were a deliberate and brilliantly executed performance. Franklin was not a simple man, and he was not naive about the difference between image and reality. He was one of the most sophisticated political minds of his century, a man who had spent decades navigating the shark-infested waters of colonial and British politics. But he knew that Paris in 1776 wanted a symbol, and he gave them exactly the symbol they were hungry for: the philosopher from the wilderness, the genius of the New World. The proof, walking and talking and charming everyone in the room, that the American experiment was something worth betting on. The French philosophical establishment fell for it completely and sincerely. Voltaire was still alive when Franklin arrived in Paris. 83 years old, frail, one of the towering intellectual monuments of the century. The two men met publicly and embraced, and the crowd around them erupted. It was one of those extraordinary theatrical moments that history occasionally produces, where symbolism and reality perfectly converge. Two old men, two monuments of the Age of Reason, one French and one American, holding each other in a Parisian salon, while the French government quietly calculated exactly how much more money to send to Washington's freezing, starving army. The audience wept. The moment was reported in newspapers across Europe, and Vergennes, reading the dispatches in his office at Versailles, allowed himself a small, cold smile. While Franklin charmed Paris, the war in America was going badly. Not just badly, catastrophically. The winter of 1776 into 1777 was the lowest point of the entire revolution. Washington's army was dissolving. Men were deserting in staggering numbers. The Continental Congress was functionally bankrupt. The British held New York in overwhelming strength and were actively working to cut New England off from the rest of the colonies. There was genuine and widespread belief among American leaders, among British commanders, and among European observers watching from a careful distance that the rebellion was finished. That Britain would crush it within months and the whole experiment would be quietly buried. Washington himself wrote letters during this period that carry the weight of a man who is looking into an abyss. He was watching his army evaporate. He was watching militia volunteers walk home when their enlistment periods expired, regardless of what was happening on the battlefield, because they had farms to tend and families to feed, and no particular obligation to die for a cause that appeared to be losing. He was commanding men who had no shoes, no adequate coats, no reliable food supply. The continental currency he was using to pay his soldiers was losing value so rapidly that it had become a subject of bitter jokes. A phrase entered the American vocabulary during this period that has never fully left it. Not worth a continental, meaning completely worthless. Because continental dollars were nearly worthless, backed by nothing, printed by a government that had no real authority to compel payment or service from anyone. Into this disaster, the French money arrived, and it did not just keep the army technically alive on paper, it changed the entire psychological calculus of the war. Because money is not simply money in a military context. Money is confidence. Money is the ability to plan beyond the next 2 weeks. Money is the difference between an army that believes it has a chance and a mob of cold, hungry, shoeless men who are making rational decisions about going home before they freeze to death. The French loans and the weapons shipments organized by Beaumarchais gave Washington something more valuable than any single tactical victory. They gave him time. They gave him the ability to keep a force in the field through the brutal winter and into the spring and summer of 1777. And then came Saratoga. In October of 1777, the American forces under General Horatio Gates defeated the British General John Burgoyne at the Battle of Saratoga in upstate New York. It was the first genuinely significant American victory of the war. Burgoyne surrendered an entire British army of nearly 6,000 men. The shock in London was immediate and profound. The assumption that had been comforting the British political establishment, the idea that the colonial rebellion was a minor disorder that would be dealt with efficiently, shattered overnight. In the courts of Europe, the message was equally clear. The Americans could actually fight. They could defeat professional British armies in the field. Supporting them was not a losing bet after all. In Versailles, the news landed like a signal flare. Vergennes had been arguing for months that the moment of open commitment had not yet arrived, that France needed to wait for evidence that the American cause was viable before exposing itself to the full consequences of open alliance. Saratoga gave him that evidence. The covert operation had succeeded in its primary purpose. It had kept the Americans alive and functional long enough for them to win a battle that changed the strategic picture entirely. Now it was time to stop pretending and make it official. Now it was time for France to step into the open. February 6, 1778. In the Hôtel de Coislin on the Place de la Concorde in Paris, two men faced each other across a table covered with diplomatic documents and signed agreements that changed the world. Conrad Alexandre Gérard, representing the Kingdom of France, sat across from Benjamin Franklin, Silas Deane, and Arthur Lee, representing the United States of America. They signed the Treaty of Amity and Commerce. They signed the Treaty of Alliance. These were the first formal military alliances in American history. And the partner on the other side of that alliance was a monarchy older than memory. France officially and publicly recognized the United States of America as an independent and sovereign nation. Not as rebellious colonists with legitimate grievances, not as a temporary inconvenience for the British Empire, but as a fully formed state with the legal right to exist, to govern itself, and to wage war in defense of that existence. The diplomatic implications of this act were enormous. No other major European power had done this. Britain was immediately and furiously aware of what it meant. Spain watched nervously, calculating its own interests in a changing strategic landscape. But France had crossed the line publicly, and there was no going back. The terms of the alliance were specific and binding. France and the United States agreed to coordinate their military efforts against Britain. France committed to continue and expand its financial and material support to the Continental Army. And, crucially, France committed its navy to the conflict. The French Navy, one of the most powerful maritime forces on Earth, was now formally at war with Britain in support of American independence. This was the peace that Vergennes had been building toward since the beginning. He had spent years arguing at court for the investment needed to rebuild French naval power after the disasters of the 7 Years' War. Every ship that had been built, every sailor trained, every cannon installed, all of it was now pointed at the strategic situation in North America and the Atlantic world. The entry of France into the war transformed it from a colonial rebellion into something genuinely global. Britain suddenly found itself fighting not just scrappy American militiamen in the forests of Virginia and Massachusetts, but a full-scale naval and military power that could threaten British interests everywhere simultaneously, from the Caribbean to India to the waters of the English Channel itself. The resources Britain had to commit to the American theater thinned dramatically. Troops had to be diverted elsewhere. Naval squadrons had to be split across multiple theaters. The strategic freedom that Britain had enjoyed in the first years of the war evaporated almost overnight. And Washington, who had been fighting a desperate defensive holding action for 2 years, suddenly had an ally that could fundamentally change the shape of the conflict. But the alliance was not clean. It was not simple. And it carried within it some deeply uncomfortable tensions that would shape everything that followed. Tensions that most celebratory accounts of the Franco-American partnership prefer not to linger on. Because France had its own agenda. It always had its own agenda. And that agenda was not identical to American interests in every respect. Here is where the story gets genuinely complex, in a way that demands attention. France did not want the United States to win too decisively. Follow that logic carefully, because it matters. Vergennes wanted Britain weakened. He wanted the American colonies to break free of British imperial control. But a fully independent, fully powerful United States, a continental republic with vast territory, enormous natural resources, and no obligations to anyone, that was not exactly the outcome Vergennes had designed this operation to produce. A grateful, somewhat dependent American republic that looked to Paris for guidance and remained somewhat manageable within the French strategic orbit, that was the ideal outcome. A client that owed France its existence, not a giant that would eventually outgrow every obligation it had ever acknowledged. This tension played out most visibly in the peace negotiations that eventually ended the war. When Britain finally agreed to negotiate seriously after the catastrophe at Yorktown, the talks convened in Paris, and both the Americans and the French had delegations at the table. The American negotiating team included Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay. Three very different men with very different temperaments, but a shared determination to get the best possible deal for the new nation, regardless of what their French allies preferred. And here is the part that most American history classes either skip entirely or mention in a single sentence without pausing to appreciate how extraordinary it was. Franklin and Adams and Jay secretly negotiated a separate preliminary peace agreement with Britain without informing France. They went behind Vergennes' back. They opened private back-channel conversations with the British negotiators and struck a deal independent of French involvement or knowledge. And it was a dramatically better deal for America than Vergennes would have permitted had he been sitting at the table. The Treaty of Paris of 1783 gave the United States not just independence from Britain, it gave them the entire territory east of the Mississippi River, from the Great Lakes all the way south to Florida. It was an extraordinary territorial expansion, far beyond what France had expected or wanted the new republic to receive. Vergennes was furious when he found out. He complained bitterly to Franklin that the Americans had violated the spirit of the alliance by negotiating separately. Franklin, with his characteristic combination of warmth and absolute steel, essentially told him, "Yes, we did, because we knew you would not get us this deal, and we needed this deal." It was breathtaking diplomatic hardball from a 77-year-old man in a fur cap. And it worked. France was not going to blow up the entire alliance over the issue. The war was over, Britain was weakened, French prestige had been substantially restored. The mission, from Vergennes' perspective, had been accomplished, even if not exactly as planned. He swallowed his anger, wrote a slightly petulant diplomatic note, and let it go. And the United States walked away from the peace table with a territory so vast that it would take another century to fully understand what they had acquired. But before the peace talks, before the treaty and the final reckoning, there was Yorktown. And Yorktown is where the French military contribution to the American Revolution reached its absolute climax, and where the argument that France saved the revolution becomes not just persuasive, but completely, undeniably, mathematically obvious to anyone willing to look at the numbers. By 1781, the war had been grinding for 6 long years. The British strategy had shifted dramatically toward the south, where the Crown hoped to find stronger loyalist support among the population and use that support to pacify the southern colonies and roll the American position northward. General Charles Cornwallis was the commander of British forces in the Southern Theatre, and he was, by any fair assessment, a formidable soldier. He was 42 years old, experienced, aggressive, and confident. He was not a cautious man. He had driven through the Carolinas with considerable force, fighting and winning battles at Camden and Guilford Courthouse, even if those victories came at costs that were quietly unsustainable. By the summer of 1781, he had brought his army north into Virginia and established his main base of operations at Yorktown, a modest tobacco port sitting on a peninsula formed by the York River and the James River, where they both flow into the Chesapeake Bay. Cornwallis chose Yorktown because it was defensible and because he expected to be supplied and reinforced by the British Navy, which maintained naval superiority in the Western Atlantic. He was not hiding at Yorktown. He was waiting for resupply and instruction. He felt secure. He had no reason not to feel secure. The British Navy had ruled these waters throughout the war. There was no reason to expect that to change. He was wrong. And the reason he was wrong had nothing to do with anything the Continental Army did or did not do. Washington and the French commander, Jean-Baptiste Donatien de Vimeur, the Comte de Rochambeau, had been planning their joint strategy for months. Rochambeau was everything Lafayette was not. Older, experienced, professionally methodical, a career soldier of the classical European school. He had arrived in Newport, Rhode Island, in July of 1780, with a French expeditionary force of 5,500 well-trained professional soldiers. He was 55 years old. courtly, precise, and absolutely committed to making the alliance work on practical terms. He treated Washington with complete respect as commanding general and worked with him with a professionalism and good faith that was genuinely remarkable given the competing pressures both men were under from their respective governments and armies. The conventional British assumption was that the combined American and French armies were building toward an assault on New York City, which remained the primary British garrison in North America. Washington and Rochambeau wanted them to keep thinking that. They staged an elaborate and carefully constructed deception operation. False documents were allowed to fall into British hands. Troop movements were exaggerated toward the north. Supply depots suggesting a New York campaign were conspicuously established. Deliberate information leaks into channels known to reach British intelligence were made. It was a masterpiece of military deception, and it worked. The British focused their attention and their defensive preparations on New York. And while they watched the wrong direction, Washington and Rochambeau moved their armies south with extraordinary speed and secrecy. Then the crucial piece fell into place with the timing of a play whose author knew exactly what he was doing. A French fleet of 28 warships under Admiral François-Joseph Paul de Grasse arrived in the Chesapeake Bay in late August of 1781. De Grasse was a big, imposing man, extraordinarily tall by the standards of his era, a veteran naval commander with decades of experience, and the kind of physical presence that commanded immediate attention in any room he entered. He had sailed from the Caribbean with his entire fleet, taking a calculated risk that left French interests in the West Indies temporarily unguarded, because he understood that this was the moment the entire war had been building toward, and he was not going to miss it. A British fleet under Admiral Thomas Graves tried to intercept the French and deny them control of the Chesapeake. On September 5, 1781, the two fleets engaged in what became known as the Battle of the Chesapeake. It was not a dramatically decisive engagement in tactical terms. No ships were sunk, casualties on both sides were moderate. In the accounts of naval battles, it does not have the epic grandeur of Trafalgar or the Nile, but its strategic consequences were among the most significant of any naval engagement in the history of the Western Hemisphere. Graves, finding the French force larger and better positioned than he had anticipated, broke off the engagement and withdrew his fleet to New York to refit and seek reinforcements. Cornwallis at Yorktown watched the British ships disappear over the horizon. The naval escape route was closed. The supply lines were cut. No reinforcements were coming, not by sea and not by land, because the combined American and French armies were now closing in on the Yorktown Peninsula from the north and west. He was surrounded on 3 sides by land and on the 4th side by a French fleet. He had approximately 8,000 soldiers. He had fortifications and artillery, but he was out of options and running out of time, and he knew it. The Siege of Yorktown lasted 3 weeks. The combined American and French forces bombarded the British positions continuously with artillery, much of it French, constructed in approaches dug closer and closer to the British lines, with the methodical precision of European siege warfare that Rochambeau's veterans understood thoroughly. On the night of October 14, 1781, 2 storming parties simultaneously attacked 2 key British redoubts outside the main fortifications. One party was American, led by Alexander Hamilton. The other was French, led by Guillaume de Dupont. Both attacks succeeded. The British defensive perimeter began to collapse. On October 19, 1781, Lord Cornwallis surrendered his army. He claimed illness and sent a subordinate, General Charles O'Hara, to perform the formal surrender. O'Hara tried to offer the British sword to Rochambeau rather than Washington, perhaps hoping to surrender to a fellow European professional soldier rather than to a colonial rebel. Rochambeau politely directed him to Washington. Washington directed O'Hara to his own subordinate, Benjamin Lincoln, who had himself been forced into a humiliating surrender to the British at Charleston the year before. There was a symmetry to it that history rarely arranges so perfectly. The band played a tune called "The World Turned Upside Down." It was the last major engagement of the American Revolutionary War, and out of the roughly 17,000 Allied troops who surrounded Yorktown on that October morning, approximately 8,000 were French. More French than American. More French soldiers than American soldiers were present at the definitive military engagement that ended the war for independence. That is not a piece of trivia. That is the single most important statistical fact in understanding what the French alliance actually meant in material, concrete, boots-on-the-ground terms. Now here is the moment we have been building toward through everything that came before. Here is the central insight that changes not just how you see this story, but how you see the entire founding era of the United States. The question that the textbooks never quite ask out loud, because asking it out loud is genuinely uncomfortable. France did not save the American Revolution because it believed in American democracy. France saved the American Revolution because doing so was the most effective weapon available for hurting Britain, restoring French prestige, and reversing the humiliations of 1763. Vergennes was not a philosopher. He was not a believer in natural rights or representative government. He was a strategist, executing a calculated plan. Louis XVI was not a friend of liberty. He was a king who needed to weaken an enemy. Beaumarchais was not a democratic crusader. He was a brilliant opportunist who saw in the American cause a project worthy of his extraordinary energies. The French alliance was, at its foundation, an alliance of strategic interest and national jealousy, not of shared values. And it worked brilliantly from the French perspective. Britain was weakened. American independence was secured. The global balance of power shifted in France's favor in meaningful ways. The score from 1763 was, if not settled completely, at least substantially balanced. Vergennes died in 1787, just 2 years before the French Revolution began. And perhaps he died at exactly the right moment, because what came next would have broken the heart of even the most cold-blooded strategist. The ideas that France helped protect and legitimize in America did not stay politely on the western side of the Atlantic. They crossed the ocean. They came home. They infected the very society that had funded them with the inevitability of a tide coming in. The French soldiers who served in America came back to France having seen something transformative, not just a military campaign, not just a tactical victory. They had lived inside a functioning republic. They had fought alongside farmers and tradesmen who believed they had the right to govern themselves and were willing to die for that belief. They had breathed the air of a society where ordinary men made real decisions that mattered. And they came back to a France that was cracking apart under the accumulated weight of its own contradictions. The cost of the American War had pushed French government finances past the breaking point. Louis XVI was forced to convene the Estates General in 1789, the first time that ancient body had met in 175 years, because he had no other mechanism for addressing the financial catastrophe that the American adventure had helped create. The Estates General became the National Assembly. The National Assembly became the Revolution. The Revolution became the Terror. The king, who had approved Vergennes' plan, who had funded the Continental Army and recognized American independence and sent his navy to blockade Yorktown, was executed by guillotine on January 21, 1793. The revolution France planted in America grew roots that reached across the ocean and consumed the very throne that had nurtured it. It is one of the most staggering and tragic ironies in the entire sweep of modern history. A monarchy funded a republic, and the republic's ideas came home and destroyed the monarchy. The irony is so perfect, it almost feels constructed, but history does not construct itself for our convenience. It simply happens, and then we spend centuries trying to understand what it means. And then there is Lafayette. We cannot conclude this story without spending real time with the Marquis de Lafayette, because he is the figure who embodies every contradiction and every genuine greatness of the French role in the American Revolution simultaneously. He is not just a character in this story, he is the story's emotional core. the place where all the cold strategic calculations and all the warm idealism meet and exist together in a single, extraordinary human life. Marie-Joseph Paul-Yves Roch Gilbert du Motier, the Marquis de Lafayette. Born in 1757 into one of the oldest and most distinguished noble families in the Auvergne region of France. Tall, red-haired, with a long, angular face and an expression of perpetual earnestness that contemporaries found both endearing and occasionally exhausting. His father, a colonel in the French army, was killed in battle fighting the British at the Battle of Minden in 1759, when Lafayette was barely 2 years old. He grew up without a father, raised by a mother who died when he was 12, inheriting one of the largest private fortunes in France as a young teenager, along with a burning personal animosity toward Britain that was not the calculated strategic resentment of a Vergennes, but something far more personal and visceral. When Lafayette first heard serious discussion of the American Revolution, he was 19 years old. 19. He was a junior French army officer with more money than he knew how to spend, a young wife of considerable social standing, a position at court that meant he attended fashionable dinners and hunting parties with the royal family, and the deep, restless boredom of a young man who knows he is capable of something important, but cannot yet figure out what that thing is. And then he heard an American officer at a dinner party in Metz describe the Declaration of Independence and explain what the colonists were fighting for. And something inside Lafayette ignited like a charge of that Beaumarchais gunpowder. He decided, with the absolute, irreversible conviction of youth, that he was going to America to fight for independence. Not because Vergennes instructed him to, not because Louis XVI ordered or encouraged him. He did it against the direct wishes of the king, who initially issued a royal order forbidding him from leaving. He did it over the objections of his family and his in-laws, who were horrified at the thought of a young nobleman throwing away his comfortable life for a colonial rebellion that most of Europe still assumed would end in British victory. He bought his own ship. He sailed in secret from the south of France. He defied royal authority on the basis of personal, moral conviction. He was 19 years old. He arrived in South Carolina in June of 1777, rode north, and presented himself at Washington's headquarters in Philadelphia. Washington received him with the slightly weary courtesy of a man who had been dealing with a parade of European officers claiming grand experience and demanding grand appointments. He had little patience left for young aristocrats who wanted glory. But Lafayette was different from the first moment. He did not ask for a command or a stipend or a position of honor. He asked to be treated as a volunteer soldier and to be taught. He wanted to learn. He wanted to serve. He was willing to start at whatever level Washington thought appropriate. Washington studied him. Washington was not a sentimental man. He was a Virginia planter who had become a general through force of will and hard experience, and a willingness to endure when almost everyone around him gave up. He did not form close personal attachments easily, but something about Lafayette got through the careful reserve. The young man's sincerity was unmistakable. His energy was extraordinary, and his willingness to subordinate his enormous ego and his aristocratic pride to the requirements of the cause was genuinely remarkable. Washington took him on, and what began as a military relationship became, over the months and years that followed, one of the deepest and most affecting friendships in American history. Lafayette fought at the Battle of Brandywine in September of 1777 and was wounded in the leg. He spent the terrible winter at Valley Forge alongside Washington's starving men, sharing their conditions with a completeness that no one had required of him, and that earned him the devotion of the American soldiers who served under him. He conducted a brilliant campaign in Virginia in the months before Yorktown, using his smaller force with such skill and agility that he kept Cornwallis from destroying the Continental Army in the south while the trap was being assembled around the British general. He was, in every concrete military and strategic sense, a significant contributor to the American victory. And then he went home. He went back to France with the ideals of the American Revolution living in his chest like a second heartbeat. He tried to apply them in France. He wrote the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, the foundational document of the French Revolution, in collaboration with Thomas Jefferson, who was then American minister to France. He tried to create a constitutional monarchy that would preserve French traditions while incorporating the principles of liberty, equality, and representative government. He commanded the National Guard in the early revolutionary years. He tried to hold the middle ground between the old order and the radical forces that were gaining momentum. He failed. The revolution spiraled past him into violence and extremism that horrified him. He was eventually forced to flee France to avoid arrest by the radical faction. He was captured by the Austrians, who imprisoned him for 5 years in conditions that nearly destroyed his health. Napoleon rose and fell. The old monarchies returned. The Bourbon Restoration brought back a king. Lafayette lived through all of it, outlasting his era by sheer determination, a monument to an age that had passed and ideas that had not. He came back to America in 1824 for a grand farewell tour. He was 66 years old. He traveled through every state of the Union. Everywhere he went, crowds of tens of thousands gathered to see him. Men and women wept openly. They were not just greeting a distinguished foreign visitor, they were greeting the living connection to the founding moment, the last of the original giants, the man who had been there when it mattered most. He died in Paris in 1834, and in his will, he left a final instruction that summarizes the whole improbable story of France and America in a single gesture. He asked to be buried in French soil, with American soil from Bunker Hill in Massachusetts mixed with the earth of his grave. French ground and American ground together, the man who belonged to both countries until his last breath, buried under both at once. So here is where we arrive. Here is what this whole story, the fake trading companies and the secret gunpowder and the philosopher in the fur cap and the desperate winter army and the French fleet in the Chesapeake and the surrender at Yorktown and the king going to the guillotine and the young aristocrat who crossed an ocean for a revolution that was not his own. Here is what all of it actually means. The American Revolution was not won by Americans alone. It was won by an alliance, a partnership between an idealistic young republic and a calculating old monarchy, held together by shared enemies, competing interests, philosophical sympathy in some quarters, pure cynical calculation in others, and the extraordinary personal relationships of individuals who are large enough to hold contradictions inside themselves without breaking. The French contribution was not supplementary. It was not a helpful addition to an American victory that was going to happen anyway. It was structural. It was the load-bearing wall. Without it, the entire edifice falls. Without French money in 1776 and 1777, Washington's army does not survive the winter. Without Beaumarchais' 90% of the gunpowder, the battles of that period are lost or never fought at all. Without the formal French alliance of February 1778, Britain never faces the strategic overextension that forces it to spread its military resources across multiple theaters and gradually lose the will to continue the war. Without the French Navy at the Battle of the Chesapeake, Cornwallis is resupplied and reinforced at Yorktown, and the siege never happens. Without the Siege of Yorktown, the political will in the British Parliament to keep funding the war does not collapse. Without that collapse, the peace negotiations that produced the Treaty of Paris do not happen on anything like American terms. The United States of America, as it exists today, with its continental territory and its constitutional framework and its 2.5 centuries of existence as a functioning republic, is the product of a French strategic calculation made in the gilded halls of Versailles by men who are primarily thinking about humiliating Britain, not building democracy. That truth demands a certain kind of intellectual honesty, a willingness to look at the origins of this nation without the comfortable lens of pure national mythology and see the full, complicated human story underneath, with all its calculations and contradictions and unexpected consequences. But here is the thing, and this matters enormously. That complexity does not diminish the achievement. If anything, it makes the achievement more remarkable, because the American founders took the help they were given, from whatever source and for whatever motive it was offered, and they built something genuinely new and genuinely lasting with it. They took French money and French guns and French ships and the idealism of a young aristocrat who refused to accept the world as it was, and they used all of it to create a republic that actually worked, that actually endured through crises that would have destroyed most political systems, that actually established a precedent for self-government that changed what was possible for human beings living in political communities everywhere on Earth. They did not do it alone, but what they did with their allies, their complicated, self-interested, brilliant, contradictory allies, was extraordinary. And the alliance itself, for all its tensions and deceptions and competing agendas, produced something that neither America nor France could have produced separately. It produced a world historical moment, a hinge point, the place where the age of kings began to give way to something new, even if nobody at the time fully understood that was what was happening. Think about what you know now that you did not know at the beginning of this. A playwright who wrote operas was secretly moving 90% of the Revolutionary Army's gunpowder. The most democratic nation in history needed a monarchy to survive. The king who saved American liberty was executed by the ideas he helped set free. A 19-year-old French nobleman crossed an ocean against royal orders because he believed in something. And the man who more than any other engineered the French intervention died, never knowing his name would be almost completely unknown to the people whose nation he helped create. So here is your question. We talk a great deal in America about the idea of exceptionalism, the idea that America is uniquely, self-sufficiently great, uniquely capable of achieving what it achieved through its own virtue, its own courage, its own ideals. But what does it mean for that idea that the most foundational moment in American history required a foreign king's money, a foreign playwright's gunpowder, a foreign fleet's cannons, and a foreign teenager's willingness to die for it to be possible? Does that complicate the myth of exceptionalism? Does it enrich it? Or does it tell us something even more interesting? That greatness has never been built alone. That the most honest story of America is a story of partnership from the very beginning. And that perhaps the most genuinely exceptional thing about the American founding is not that it was purely American, but that it was open enough, brave enough, and clear-eyed enough to accept help and use it to build something that still stands. Write your answer in the comments. Tell us what you think. We are genuinely asking. And if this video cracked open something you did not know was there, if it made the founding era feel more real and more complex and more human than it did before, then subscribe to Cradle of Democracy, because this is exactly what we do here. We go behind the myth. We find the real story. We bring the dead back to life and let them surprise you. Check out our video on the Constitutional Convention next, where we take you inside the room where the founders nearly destroyed everything they had built before they figured out how to save it. The arguments that happened in that room in Philadelphia in 1787 make everything you just heard sound almost simple. You absolutely do not want to miss it.